Good evening. I've been a little bit rushed tonight, but I'm here and we're ready to go. Thanks for showing up one more time here. We'll see if we can't talk a little bit about flight instructor Checkride notes. I called it. We'll use the PTS a little bit and other references as we go along. These are our panel of course members, as always. I don't think Bert Compton's with us this evening. He's off in Alaska, but I think everybody else is here. And Soaring Safety Foundation resources are the same as we've reviewed before. And so tonight's topics, we'll talk, Dan Grudgel sent in some information. We'll talk about him. He's a NOAA meteorologist, so obviously his points probably be somewhat related to weather. Joe Scarcella, he's a DPE and a professor. He made some comments. I made a few comments. Bob Wander, Soaring Safety Foundation, CFI-G, author of Soaring Training Manuals Extraordinaire, and he compiled all this stuff for us. So we'll let him talk as much as he wants, and he can cut in on my presentation, whenever he sees things that he thinks need to be emphasized. Mike Havener, he's a DPE, and Tony Condon, he's a DPE and also a Soaring Safety Foundation advisor. So those are mainly the contributors for tonight. And we'll start off with Dan Grudgel, DPE, former meteorologist. So I'm just going to let you read those, and then we'll talk for a few minutes. So I have to agree with Dan. And you'll see in my notes later on when I go through some of them. I find people the lesson plans aren't what you'd like them to be, and we'll discuss that. I guess a little later this evening at greater length. But many people download lesson plans off the internet. I think that's a mistake personally. It's not illegal. It's certainly you can utilize those if you choose to, but I don't think it's as effective as if you develop your own lesson plans, because to develop those lesson plans, you have to do the research. In other words, you have to do the research. And I'll talk about how I can tell whether they've done the research or not based on their lesson plan and their presentation of the lesson plan. So I added this reference for Dan about, we've done one reason that I've emphasized the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, and we've talked about that for the last 10 sessions, is because of the importance of it. And so I gave you a couple of references there. Chapter 7 talks about planning and instructional activity, including how to write a lesson plan, and Chapter 5 includes how to organize your material. So, and then Dan also mentions that candidates are deficient in describing how to teach stalls and spins. So, and in Dan's case, he says that you will be asked to do stalls and spins on the Checkride. So I know that's not required, but it's certainly allowed by DPEs to ask to see a demonstration of spins. And so I think that, and sounds like if you go to Dan, you better bring a glider that'll spin and make sure the CG is correct and everything else, because it's not the same as doing just pulling the nose up, cranking in full rudder and letting the nose pitch back down again, and boom, bingo, bango, it develops into a spin. I mean, I think that spins should be taught out of accelerated stalls. So get into a steep turn, 45, 50, 60 degrees of bank, and keep pulling back on the stick till you reach the backstop. And sure enough, like in the Atlantic, it worked beautifully. As soon as you reach the backstop, the thing would just roll right over into a spin. And so I think teaching spins and understanding spins more in a context like that of where you might find yourself in a spin if your applicant doesn't do things right is a more effective method of teaching spin and spin recoveries. And of course, the skidding turn, the flat skidding turn will produce a spin as well. So Dan goes on to say, your CFI privileges are not confined to your home state, and the candidates that you train and license will fly in all 50 states, or can fly. So know how to teach weather fundamentals for North America. You're not just your local environment. I think those are good comments, good words to go by. And I emphasize the same thing because, if I, just as Dan says, you're going to be licensed to fly in all 50 states, and you could walk out of the door with your brand new ink still wet on the certificate, private pilot glider certificate, walk across the street, buy a motor glider. The person who's selling you the motor glider checks you out in the motor glider and hopefully signs you off, and off you go. Self-launch motor glider, and off you go, and you could fly it all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast the very next day. And so I agree with Dan. You need to talk about or think about the weather, not just in your local environment, but all across the country, and how to interact it with that weather. Thermals, ridge fly, east, intermountain and west, mountain wave east and intermountain west, convergence lift, so on. And then his second point is check out the series of articles in Soaring Magazine, Weather to Fly by Dan Grudgel, from the May 2011 through the July 2012. Soaring Magazines are online. They're part of the website. Go on there and look at them. I think that you'll find some very valuable tips and information about many of the things that Dan would like you to know. And in all honesty, all of us DPEs would like you to know. So the fundamentals of weather are well described and explained. Author Grudgel notes, however, that many of the references provided in the series have been updated. The FAA publications, Aviation Weather, and the FAA Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Chapter 7 or Chapter 12, which talks about weather theory, are good sources for studying. And I've got some updated information about that here shortly in the presentation. In fact, here they are. Aviation Weather Handbook, FAA Hotel 8083-28 Alpha. It came out about 2 years ago now, a little over 2 years ago. And in there, amongst other things, amongst many, many, many good things that you need to be aware of and be able to teach your students about, is the soaring forecast, which is found on chapter 27, page 77. So be sure that you note that, besides all the other really good information that's found in the Aviation Weather Handbook. The aviation weather used to be spread amongst about a half a dozen advisory circulars, and they about 2 years ago now, a little over 2 years ago, the FAA consolidated it all into one handbook, the Aviation Weather Handbook, and it looks like this. The Aviation Weather Handbook. It's pretty thick. It's got a lot of information in it. You can download it off the internet. You don't have to buy the book, but it's an excellent resource for you to have as an instructor and for your students to have knowledge about, and many things. Pilot's Handbook, Aeronautical Knowledge. That's the updated version, -25C, chapters 12 and 13. And then for soaring type weather, we got skysight.io, we've got xcskies.com, we've got topmeteo.eu. We still have Dr. Jack. He's, that's kind of it's free. The one nice thing about Dr. Jack is it's free. He would like you to make a small donation to help keep the website up and running, but he doesn't insist on it. And I make a small donation every year. I usually donate $20 every year. So think about that. And it's not as detailed as like SkySight or Top Media, but and I'm not that familiar with XC Skies, but it's not as detailed as that either. So I mean, but it is a kind of a good reference to just kind of get a general idea what the soaring weather might be for that day. Joe Scarcella, he's a PhD in education, a university professor, and a DP. So, and he makes the comments. Publications that candidates must bring to the CFI-G practical test are current editions of the Glider Flying Handbook, the FAA Aviation Instructor Handbook. He put in there FARs, but I kind of delineated it a little bit greater. And I 14 CFR parts 43, 61, 91, and 49 CFR part 830. I'm sure most of you are familiar with 43. That's the maintenance chapter part. 61 is the pilot part, and 91 is the knowledge about airspace and other rules. And then, of course, the 49 CFR Part 830 is for the National Transportation Safety Board accident reporting requirements. So you should be familiar with all those. Aeronautical Information Manual, AIM. The glider POH for the type of aircraft that you've been flying. Those are his recommendations to bring to any, and I've got a few others myself. So we'll look at that. Joe also says candidates for initial CFI-G generally do not do well when quizzed about the fundamentals of instruction described in the FAA Aviation Instructor's Handbook, e.g., learning plateaus, defense mechanisms, level of learning, rote understanding, application, correlation. Those are the 4 levels of learning. You should have those memorized. I mean, that's, you've got to be a subject matter expert. And these are the tips of the iceberg, in my opinion, that Joe is mentioning here. If you don't know this stuff, well, you need more study. So before you attempt to take the CFI-G practical test. And remember, the CFI-G practical test is all about your ability safely to teach soaring. So knowledge of the fundamentals of instruction is essential for that successful outcome. Joe is a PhD in education. He understands and knows about the importance of being an instructor and knowing how to teach. And that's basically what his, and I agree with Joe 100%. You need to learn how to teach, and just knowing the material isn't enough. You have to be able to you have to practice the skills of presentation and preparation and the reviews and evaluations. You have to practice those skills to be a adequate instructor. I put this slide in here basically just to pitch Bob a little bit. He's an SSF advisor, CFI-G, author of Learning to Fly Gliders and the Maze Easy series of glider training books. If you don't know what those are, you really need to open up. This is the back of here's Bob's Learning to Fly Gliders, and on the back it's got all of his things that he's authored, and also he edits and publishes the Glider Mentor series, which are articles and training publications that people have written, and Bob publishes them with their permission to the flying community. Mike Havner, DPE. I just got this in this afternoon. The biggest recurring issue I see is that the applicant looks at the CFI practical test the same way they have looked at every other FAA practical test. I relate this back to the recommending CFI, who should emphasize that the CFI practical test is not about how they fly, but rather how they teach people to fly. Let's face it, we already hold a commercial pilot certificate, so they have been demonstrated that they can fly. Along those lines, applicants are often weak regarding the fundamentals of instruction. There we go again about fundamentals of instruction. The teaching part, learning how to teach. And primarily the laws of learning, lesson planning, and evaluation and critique. And there again, there it is again, lesson planning, laws of learning. Tony Condens talks about he's had, in 5 years of being an examiner, I've conducted 18 CFI-G check rides, including initial, add-on, renewal, reinstatement, and 3 have failed and 83% pass. So horror stories about pass rates may not be as scary as advertised on airplane-centric internet message boards. Of the failures, 2 were during the oral exam, and basically both of them were not really prepared to teach the subjects. One had a decent understanding of the knowledge, but clearly had not spent any time considering or practicing how to deliver the information to a student. Basic questioning stumped him. He just wasn't prepared. Another oral exam failure was similar. However, for the topics which I had told him to prepare, he was pretty good. But when I would ask something outside the 2 of the or 3 scenarios I had provided, there was nothing. He hadn't been prepared in the entire pre-TS and had only focused on the exact items I had told him to expect. You got to prepare for the entire test, folks. You know, you might get from the examiner, you know, these are some of the emphasis items that, you know, the FAA wants us to emphasize. These are the required areas that you have to prepare. But, you know, it says right in there, you know, this required task plus 1 other. Well, you got to be prepared for the other tasks. So don't short yourself, and more so yet, don't short your students. You know, if you short yourself on these items, you're really shorting your students because they're the ones that ultimately suffer the results, and that's why we as examiners need to be very particular about, you know, how we conduct our exams. And as an instructor, you know, if I'm sure there's some people out there on this as instructors preparing instructor applicants, you know, you got to prepare them adequately, and you've got to sit there just like your examiner sits there and let them talk and explain to you and see if they make any sense. Because I'm telling you right now, many of the flight instructor applicants that I've listened to, they just don't make any sense what they're talking about. It doesn't flow. It doesn't have a good, he or she doesn't have a good background understanding of what they're trying to teach, and it just doesn't make any sense. So be prepared, you know, make sure that your instructor applicants, if you're an instructor that are preparing applicants, has the ability to teach and force them to teach. Tony goes on to say that one flight failure was a guy who skidded the turn to final. Well, now, I'm sure that, and landed long on his normal landing. I suspect he intended to slip the turn to final. It has been a regular theme in airplanes and gliders for me for the last 2 or 3 years that applicants add inside rudder during the turn, demonstrating that they don't actually know the difference between a slip and a skid. So again, Tony's right on. You know, I got to admit that I find the same errors that, you know, people are, some of the the applicants that I've examined, uh, they don't know the difference between a slip and a skid, because when I ask them, are you more likely to, if you stall the aircraft, are you more likely to spin out of a slip or out of a skid? They say either one. Doesn't matter. Doesn't make any difference. As long as if you're uncoordinated, you're likely to spin if you stall. And folks, that's just not true. Now nothing is impossible, but I challenge you to get into a spin out of a slip. It's almost aerodynamically impossible. A skid is a different story, but out of a slip, that's why we're allowed to do slipping turns in the pattern and slips on final close to the ground. I mean, if we were, just because it's uncoordinated, that is the balls on one side and the turn needles on the other side, or the yaw strings on one side, and you're slipping. I mean, it's it's almost impossible to get into a spin out of a slipping turn, even if you stall. And so it's really important to understand that. And if you just use the term uncoordinated flight could produce a stall, well, your student's going to be very leery of slips. They won't want to do slips close to the ground. They'll do what I call a pretend slip, where they put about a quarter inch of rudder in and a quarter inch of aileron in, and they call that a slip. And it's force your students to get into a real honest to goodness slip, a full slip, like we have to do in the glider community. We have to demonstrate a full slip on in the pattern and landing, the slip to landing maneuver that we have to demonstrate. And again, I talked about it before, but it's very well
illustrated
on the Soaring Safety Foundation website. Bert Compton took the time to produce a video about the slips in the maneuver that's required during the practical test, slips to a landing, and he does an excellent job of it. And people say, well, you can't slip a fiberglass glider. Well, he does it in an ASK 21, and he does an excellent job of it. And you just have to. That's what you have to do. I mean, it's in the PTS, and it'll still be in the ACS whenever we change over. I can almost guarantee it. Okay, so
Ron, Wander here. Can I weigh in for a moment?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. A couple items. Of all the DPE remarks that I collected for this presentation tonight, this is the one that alarmed me the most, that candidates coming up for CFI glider, who already have commercial privileges in glider, cannot tell the difference between a slip and a skid. That's alarming. For you who become instructors, I recommend, I was taught this 30 years ago by an excellent instructor, describe for your students the difference between uncoordinated flight, which is accidental, and cross-controlled flight, such as in a forward side or turning slip, which is deliberate. You've decided to cross-control the glider in order to achieve a greater rate of descent. That's all I got, Ron. Thanks.
Thanks for that additional clarification, Bob. You're absolutely correct. I'm appalled as well that people are so, they've got in their head, and it's partially because instructors have made the unsubstantiated claim that if you are uncoordinated and stall the aircraft, you could get into a spin. And so, quite honestly, you can't blame them for being leery about slipping, because they perceive that as uncoordinated flight. But as Bob just mentioned, it's deliberate. It's deliberate. And it's very safe. And so to group that in with skidding flight is a misnomer and not a good instructional technique. You should teach that. So I have in airplanes, I have a maneuver that I like to teach, and that's I'll line up on a road that's perpendicular to the wind at about 1,000 feet, and I'll initially crab into the wind, and it's sort of a takeoff on the rectangular course that is a ground reference maneuver that private pilots are required to demonstrate during a practical test in airplanes, single engine land. And so I line people up, and you can do this in a glider too. To be quite honest, you just have to start a little higher, so it's not as necessarily as close up as down on the ground, but or close to the ground. But you can start in a glider, pick a road that's perpendicular to the wind, and crab into the wind, and just fly like that for 10 or 15 seconds, and then go from a crab into the wind into a side slip into the wind, and still try to follow that road that you're over, and hold that for 10 or 15 seconds, and kind of look, demonstrate that, too much bank is gonna, if you run out of rudder, it's going to start to turn you, but too much bank, you're going to usually slip into the wind, and not enough bank, you're going to slip away from the wind, and the rudder lines you up with the road in a side slip, just like the rudder lines you up with I don't really like to talk about it that way, but the rudder basically will line the longitudinal axis up with the glider parallel to the runway. And then from the side slip, I have people go into the forward slip. Same direction still. Keep that wing down that you had in the side slip and just add a little more rudder. And now you're in a forward slip such that the longitudinal axis is not parallel to the direction of flight. And fly along like that for 10 or 15 seconds, and then come transition out of the side slip out of the forward slip back into a side slip. We don't practice the transitions enough. And to do a maneuver like, if you start at 2,000 feet and you do this maneuver and then you turn around, you can probably only lose 500 or 600 feet. You turn around and come back the other way. And now they've got to practice a crab, a side slip, and a forward slip with the other wing down, so you got both left and right forwards, crabs, side slips, and forward slips, both with the left wing down and the right wing down, just by flying back and forth. And you'll probably only lose about 1,000 feet. And I think it's good practice you practice the transitions when you're up high, so that now when you get down low and you're actually in the pattern and the approach to landing, you can say, remember, we just practiced this. You should be in a side slip here, for the crosswind for the touchdown. So, or you're a little bit high, and we're not going to use dive brakes today, so you need to get in that forward slip. And you utilize the training that you did just up high, just previous, in the training that you're doing down low on the approach. Okay, so here's some of my comments. The effective instructor must be an SME. And everybody's saying SME, SME, okay? That's a subject matter expert. The only way that you can be a subject matter expert is you've got to read the books. You've got to get your nose in the glider flying handbook. You got to get your nose in the aviation instructor's handbook. You got to get your nose in the PTS for the commercial and the private and the flight instructor. You've got to get your nose in the book. The PTS delineates the standards by which you're going to be measured. The glider flying handbook delineates the actual procedure, how to fly that particular maneuver. What this does, and what I try to emphasize for new instructors to do, the reason I emphasize this for new instructors to do this, is because you don't want either your habits that you've gotten into, which may be slightly out of sync, to propagate forward into your students. And or if you were taught incorrectly on a maneuver, you don't want to perpetuate that incorrect teaching with your students. it's kind of a balance. We try to, every time we get a new instructor, we try to retrain them. Yeah, okay, you know how to do a steep turn. Yeah, okay, you know how to do this. You know how to do that. You know how to do a slip to landing. But sometimes when you read the manual and read the actual words again to reemphasize in your own mind what you're trying to do, you might discover that you're doing, yeah, there's little nuances that you missed, and or that have over time you've allowed yourself become complacent and not doing it exactly like the book wants you to do it. And being an instructor, you have to teach it exactly like it should be taught. So um, I would, if I were king, but I'm not, I would have people seek a basic or advanced ground instructor certificate first and practice and then after they get that certificate, they can actually instruct people and sign their logbooks and make presentations in either individuals or small groups, and stumble your way along actually making a presentation and discovering the things that you forgot to write down or make notes on, or because your students will ask a question and you don't know the answer to that question, so you need to make notes about that and then go discover what the answers to those questions were. And the only way that you can do that is if you actually practice teaching a little bit. And this, to go get your basic or advanced ground instructor certificate, it's basically just a test. Uh, you don't have to do any practical test or anything like that. It's a knowledge test only, and you get that instructor. Now, granted, you have all the privileges as a flight instructor that you have as a ground instructor. So it's once you become a flight instructor, they don't go away. Your ground instructor privileges don't go away, but um, if you had a little practice, you'd be amazed at how the things that you have don't realize, it's either you've forgotten or the little nuances of what you're trying to teach. So
So,
a
Ron,
few other, go ahead.
the Soaring Society has been promoting Condor as a method for providing some training. And it's not a flight simulator, so you can't do flight training in it, but you can do ground training. And a ground instructor can provide training and get practice in being an instructor using Condor. And so that's what we've done at our club is we've had our ground instructors providing some of the training in Condor to our candidates and students.
Very good point, Rich. And I failed to mention that, and I agree with you 100%. That's a very good point. And so I would recommend that as well, because you're right. You as an instructor candidate, when you actually start to put words that you've read about and trying to teach somebody uh, your your thoughts into words, you stumble and it's difficult at times, and so the more practice you have at it, the more comfortable you'll be at it, and the more comfortable you'll be at training your students, which is the ultimate goal here. I mean, passing a check ride is just a very basic step, to be quite honest. Being an effective flight instructor is a much larger leap, and you really any way, shape, or form you can find to practice your technique, your presentation, your preparation is a good thing. And so whether it's you know guy down the street or guy or gal down the street or your mother or your father or your sister or your brother, I mean, you can practice on them and see how effective you can be. So, other references that weren't mentioned earlier.
Ron, Wander here. Here's a
Yeah.
question that just came in to you. Do you recommend getting the basic or advanced ground instructor certificates, FAA certificates, if you want to be a glider CFI-G, and if so, do you need to learn content specific to airplanes, rotorcraft, and other categories? Over.
To take those knowledge tests, I believe, yes, you will. So,
Thank you.
Yes, I believe I'm not as familiar as I should be about the actual knowledge test that you take. I know at least a portion of the knowledge test. Well, you also have to take the fundamentals of instructing knowledge test, okay, which you're going to have to take anyway to be a flight instructor. So you have to take the knowledge test, the fundamentals of instruction knowledge test, and then you also have to take, I believe, basic would probably be adequate, because advanced is for like instrument instructors and things like that. But so basic ground instructor, but you are going to have to learn some things about airplanes in order to take it. And, the cram courses will get you through it, get you through the test. I just issued a ground instructor certificate to a, let's see, how old was she, or is she? She's 16 years old, and she's learning how to fly gliders, and she wanted to have a better understanding of the material, and so she decided to get her ground instructor certificate, and she passed the 2 knowledge tests that she had to take, and so now she's a ground instructor, and she intends to teach the glider knowledge for the private pilot certificate to her friends, and because they, and she's going to practice, and she specifically told me that she did it so that she can gain a better understanding of what she's trying to learn to be a private pilot, glider pilot. And so, and she figured that one of the best ways to do that is to get her ground instructor certificate first, and that will force her to become more familiar with the material. So, does that answer the question, you think, Bob?
I think so. I'll just add that if you, as a potential CFI glider candidate, if you have to actually learn something to earn your basic ground instructor certificate about airplanes in particular, that will be very helpful, because many of the candidates you will eventually train are transitioning from airplanes to glider. And if you yourself are glider only, your lack of knowledge about airplanes will make it more difficult for you to be a really effective glider flight instructor for those transition to glider candidates coming to you from the world of airplanes. Over.
Yeah. Good point. Good point, Bob. Very good point. So like I said, other references, the risk management handbook, we've got that here. We've got a copy of it right here. The weight and balance handbook, I have a copy, but I couldn't find it. You can download all this stuff off the FAA website. The weight and balance handbook is really valuable because it shows you the different ways that weight and balance can be performed, whether it's, mathematically or graphically, or using tables. And so, the weight and balance handbook is a valuable resource for you, the instructor, to be able to teach weight and balance effectively. And then there's all kinds of advisory circulars, and I listed some here just so that if you go back and you look at this, you can look at them. But 6198 Echo is, see, I wrote some references for myself to understand. That's currency requirements and guidance for flight reviews is the 6198 Echo. 6191 Kilo is the Wings Pilot Proficiency Program, and it talks about that. And that's something that you, as a flight instructor, should be promoting. 6165J, that's an absolute must because that offers sample endorsements. And you need to know what endorsements are necessary and what training is necessary to give that endorsement. And so that's an absolute must. So 6194 is an old one, and it actually says that it's out of date, but I think it's still something that's worthwhile for glider flight instructors to have knowledge about. And it's titled Pilot Transition Course for Self-Launching and Powered Sailplanes. And so even though it's out of date, and it still offers you some valuable information about what you might want to include if you're training a pilot to be transitioning to a motor glider or a self-launch sailplane. So 61107B is aircraft operations above flight level 250 of 25,000 feet. Talks about, hypoxia and oxygen deprivation and other things like that. We do operate gliders above 25,000, and I think it's important that you know how to at least be able to reference to somebody what they should go, what a resource they could use to help them with that accomplishment. 60-28 Bravo is the English language standard. And when you go to certify, the flight instructors, are allowed to help a person get their student pilot certificate and go on the 8710 IACRA and sign off in there that, their application. And one of the things they have to substantiate is the English language standards. And so, you as new instructors, even the old instructors are on this phone call, need to realize that if you think there's a English language problem, you must, it's not that you should, you must refer that person to the FSDO and let the FSDO decide whether they meet the English language standard. So it's incumbent and the responsibility of every flight instructor. And one of the responsibilities you have is to aid an applicant in the issuance of their student pilot certificate. And one of the requirements is they have to meet the English language standards. 68-1 Alpha talks about basic med, which again doesn't necessarily affect you as a glider instructor or for glider pilots. But if a pilot comes to you, as Bob mentioned, an airplane pilot comes to you and you say, gee, is your medical current or something like that? Well, and they say, well, I'm on basic med. You, the instructor, should have some basic knowledge about what that means. What does basic med mean? And so it allows them to fly airplanes, but only a certain size of airplane and certain horsepower, and you can't go above 10,000 feet. And there's other rules. Now, I understand, and I'm not trying to promote that, glider pilots have to have medicals, because they don't. But they do have to be in compliance with 6153. And so you should make sure FAR Part 6153, they have to be in compliance with that, which basically says if they have any known medical deficiencies, they have to abstain from flying until they get that corrected. So 90-66 Charlie is operations at non-towered airports. We operate at non-towered airports. Most glider fields are non-towered. And so it might behoove you to look at that advisory circular 90-66 Charlie. And 91-73 Bravo talks about, it's a Part 91 advisory circular, talks about single pilot procedures during taxi operations. And, you say, well, taxi operations, we don't taxi gliders. But there again, if you're in a motor glider, a touring type motor glider, you could be out in an airport where taxiing around and you have to know the procedures and things like that with, talking to the tower or just making radio calls. And so 91-73 Bravo talks to that. And there are other advisory circulars that are important, but those are some of the ones that I found to be most important to me as a instructor and pilot examiner. Okay, weak areas on the CFI-G Checkride. oral exam. Poor use of internet lesson plans. If you're going to download your lesson plans off the internet, which I do not recommend, but I can't stop you. Nobody can stop you from downloading a lesson plan off the internet. At least don't be going through it for the first time in front of the examiner. I mean, I remember just recently, an instructor applicant, an airplane instructor applicant, proudly handed me his lesson plan for that topic that I had asked for, and so I could follow along. Well, he went down through it, and I noticed that he skipped several items on the lesson plan. And so, guess what kind of probing questions I asked at his conclusion of his presentation, and he didn't know the answers. Well, obviously, he hadn't been down through that lesson plan. If he had, you'd think that he would have prepared himself better and looked up the answers of those questions so that he could make a more thorough presentation. If you have lesson plans that are pristine, they're just, they're pristine outline with no side scribbled notes or anything like that, chances are, it's an indication to me as an examiner that you really haven't been down through that lesson plan, even if you developed it yourself, because I make notes on my lesson plans all the time. So all things that I know that I should improve on. So many, 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 many times I find that they're not an SME, a subject matter expert. They haven't read enough. They haven't absorbed the information enough. They cannot explain flight maneuvers to the degree that they need to be able to explain them. I mean, one of the maneuvers that I have them teach me, both on the ground and in the air for gliders, is the steep turn. Well, the steep turn it requires a lot of correlation between many different aspects of the aircraft. You have to know about aerodynamics. You have to know about stall speeds and the bank angle, the stall speed relationship, and the load factor relationship to the bank angles. And there's a lot of different little facets over banking tendency. The fact that the nose tends to pitch, will want to try to pitch down as you get into a steeper and steeper bank, and requiring you to apply more and more back pressure. And that's because the aircraft is trimmed for a different angle of attack than it is in the turn. You have to fly at a higher angle of attack in a turn, especially a steep turn, than you do in level flight. And therefore, that's the reason that you have to apply back pressure, elevator pressure, is to force the aircraft's wing to fly at a higher angle of attack. So teaching to the test versus teaching the material. Unfortunately, an awful lot of people, they open up the PTS, in our case, ACS in the airplane pilots instructor's case, and they go down the list of things that are in the PTS. Well, that's not teaching the material. That's teaching the test. And if you prepare a student that way, that's a poor way to prepare a student for a knowledge test, or for knowledge test and or a practical test, either one. Teach them the material. Open up the glider flying handbook, or open up the pilot's handbook of aeronautical knowledge, or open up the weather flying handbook, and teach the material. Teach them what cold fronts look like, and warm fronts, and occluded fronts, and teach them the material. Now, don't just teach them the items that happen to appear in the test under the PTS. Not understanding the difference between a lesson plan, a syllabus, and a curriculum. Those are all individual types of things, and you should be able to understand them and be able to reiterate them. That was, I went through that several weeks ago and about the lesson plan, and I believe it's chapter 7, and it talks about all three of those things. What criteria do you use when evaluating a student pilot before solo? And so initially you might say, well, I've had some people, some instructor applicants, they kind of look at you dumbfounded at first, and then they finally say, well, I'd evaluate them in accordance with the criteria that's in the PTS, or in the case of the airplane at ACS. But that's not necessarily valid criteria. And you want to be consistent. So you have to have some kind of criteria. And I recommend that you use if you open up the glider flying handbook, you'll have a list of common errors. And I recommend that you make sure that they're not making those common errors on a regular basis. That certainly is a valid evaluating criteria to use. And you don't want them to be, making those same errors over and over again. Not understanding what training is required before making an endorsement. You're putting your signature in a person's logbook when you make an endorsement that says, I've done the training. That's basically, it may not say it in those words, but that's what it says. It says that I have done the training for John Doe, and he or she is prepared to demonstrate that training, that required training on an exam, So remember, you're putting your signature in the book and says that you've done the training. That's the glider pilots are maybe perhaps a little better at this, but than airplane pilots. But what endorsements are required if you have an airplane single engine land pilot and he or she wants to fly gliders? Well, and more importantly, what is the training that's required before you can make that endorsement? So one of the endorsements that you have to make sure they're in compliance with is because is found under 6131 Delta 2. Okay. And in a nutshell, it says that they're qualified to fly an aircraft in solo flight. In this case, it would be glider. They're allowed to fly a glider in solo flight, an ASK 21 or a Schweitzer 233, whatever training glider that you train them in. But if they're a transition pilot, airplane single engine land pilot transitioning to fly gliders, they also must meet, number one, the pilot in command requirements, which is 61. Excuse me. I'm having a moment here. It's the flight review requirement. What's that?
6156?
Yeah, 56. I wanted to say 6151, but I knew that wasn't right. 6156, the flight review requirements. In order to be pilot in command, which is what you're signing them off for in accordance with 6131 Delta 2, in order to be pilot in command, they also must meet the 6156 requirements for flight review. So just remember that and make sure that they meet those requirements. And basically, if you look at the 6131 Delta 2, it says they must be trained in the aeronautical knowledge areas and the flight maneuvers commensurate with the level of pilot certificate that they hold. In other words, if they want to be able to fly the glider, you go into, say, private pilot, you go into 105 is the knowledge that they have to have. And you got to go down through there and make sure you've trained them in all those knowledge areas. And then 61107 is the flights, the maneuvers, and the areas of operation that they have to be knowledgeable about as well. And you have to train them in all those areas of operation and all those knowledge areas before you can make the 6131 Delta 2 endorsement. And you're going to have to, make sure they don't have to meet the private pilot currency requirements or proficiency requirements at that point, just a solo. But you certainly have to train them in all those items. It's a big responsibility. that 6131 Delta 2 endorsement is a big responsibility for you to transition a private airplane pilot to fly gliders. Using the PAVE checklist as a risk management checklist. Hopefully by now you're all familiar with what the PAVE checklist is. And so I highly recommend that you talk about it to pilots all the time, and reinforce that every time you meet with them. And also, I find that they don't use scenario-based training, SBT, during the presentation of their material. It's incumbent upon instructors to teach in an SBT or a scenario-based training type method, because that's more effective than just going over the numbers, so to speak, a rote memorization of what the stall speed is. Instead, what circumstances might you find yourself nearing a stall, or what scenario might you find yourself nearing a stall, and what would you do about it? So, give them some scenarios that are realistic and they can utilize for their training. During the flight exam, flight instructors not being able to demonstrate and evaluate the required maneuvers at the same time. You've got to be able to talk and demonstrate at the same time, and then you have to be able to evaluate when you turn it over to your applicant, the pilot examiner, pretending to be the applicant. You have to be able to evaluate what they're doing wrong. I mean, I make it very obvious. I try to make it very obvious. I use too much rudder at a turn, which is a skid, which is a no-no, and you've got to be able to evaluate what's going on. Or so think about, if they use too much bank during slow flight, evaluate what they're doing, or what the examiner is doing, the simulating, and be able to evaluate what's happening. If you can see when a person is trying to fly. Well, we're going to talk about it in a minute. Pitch attitude versus airspeed. I'll talk about it in a minute. How to teach flying on tow and emergencies on tow. When years ago, I mean, it was a little bit controversial when I first became a flight instructor as to how you maneuver the glider side to side on the tow. Like when you're boxing the wake, how do you maneuver the glider out to the right or out to the left? And many instructors I ran across during those years said you use the rudder, but that's not really the way to do it. The way to do it is use very, very shallow banks, coordinated with rudder, and very, very shallow bank coordinated with rudder, and the glider will just move right to one side or the other. I mean, it doesn't have anything else to do. It has to do that. I watched a candidate once on a Checkride. He had full rudder in because he was trying to maneuver it with rudder to the left or right. He had full rudder in and a slight amount of bank in the opposite direction, and it never moved out of the center position behind the tow plane. And he had full rudder in there, and he could not understand why the glider wouldn't move in the way that the rudder was, because that's the way he'd been trained. So I would encourage you not to train to use the rudder during maneuvering behind the tow plane. Use the bank angles, very, very, very shallow bank angles. In emergencies, review the emergencies on the ground, review the emergencies in the air, do some practice emergencies. You have to think. The big emergency is the PT3, okay, but there are others. I mean, what would you do if you got to tow release altitude and the tow rope wouldn't release? What are your signals? What are just present that, hey, you get to altitude and the tow rope won't release. What are you going to do? Well, if you have a radio, they might say, well, I'll call them on the radio. And they said, you know what? You call them on the radio, but there's something wrong. Maybe they're on the wrong frequency. Maybe you're on the wrong frequency. There's something wrong, and you can't communicate with the radio. What are you going to do? And just keep creating, leading the scenario on until they've shown or they've demonstrated all the different things that they have been trained to do or trained to think about to do as they move on with the emergency on tow, like they can't get the tow release to release. And that's a real, that could be a real problem in that if you're using a Schweitzer hook and you use that small ring on the tow, small toe ring rather than a Schweitzer ring, it could jam up the toe, the toe release. And so, like a 233 or a 126. So, I mean, it can happen. Um, Poor demonstration of slackline recovery. Understand how to recover from slackline and be able to do it efficiently. Be able to induce slack toe line efficiently, so that um, you can demonstrate it and the recovery, and then you can put it in for your applicant or your student. Poor demonstration of stall recognition and recovery. Too many times, read the PTS and read what it says. It says, in a nutshell, establish a pitch attitude that the glider will stall at. It doesn't say do a little bit at a time and eventually get to the point where it's just mushing along. I mean, you can get the ASK 21 or a 233, depending upon the weights, just to sit there with full back stick and just mush along. And that's not really a demonstration of a stall. So on the private, they have to be able to demonstrate a full stall, right? And recover from a full stall. On the commercial, it can be a partial or an incipient stall, first indication. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. Poor demonstration of the slip to landing maneuver. We already discussed that. Poor demonstration of an accuracy landing. Tony mentioned that in his comments earlier. He said, that not only did the person not know how to slip to land, but then it didn't demonstrate the accuracy landing either. And this is a commercial glider pilot who's been trained to do those and demonstrated those at one time, but now they can't demonstrate them on a flight instructor Checkride. Come on, you didn't practice enough. If you were the recommending instructor, you didn't practice enough scenarios. Pitch attitude versus airspeed. I don't talk too much about airspeed, to be quite honest. I talk about 3 pitch attitudes. I talk about the slow flight pitch attitude. I talk about the normal cruise pitch attitude. And I talk about the approach pitch attitude that will result in these airspeeds. So you can look inside, glance inside, and just make sure that confirm that pitch attitude is producing the airspeed that you want it to produce. But you shouldn't be staring at the airspeed indicator. And the way that you can tell your applicant or your student is doing that is the pitch attitude will be all over the place because they're chasing after the airspeed. They'll look down and they'll see that the speed is 5 knots too fast. And rather than just pitch slightly, they'll pitch way up, staring at the airspeed indicator and watching it come down. And by the time it comes down, it's 5 knots too slow by the time they get the pitch attitude back down again. So you can tell where they're staring at that airspeed indicator versus flying it by pitch attitude. And I would highly recommend that you emphasize to them that they fly it by pitch attitude. Slipping and skidding turns. Bob Wander already talked about that. I've emphasized it enough. And the old 5 side effects of a turn. It's an old joy of soaring thing. I'm an old guy that learned via the joy of soaring. But basically the 5 side effects of the turn is the adverse yaw, right? What causes adverse yaw? You need to know what causes it. You need to know how to coordinate it, and then you have what the joy of soaring called the diving tendency. As you roll into a bank, the nose will tend to pitch down, and that's because the glider is trimmed for that angle of attack. And as you roll into the bank, you need to fly it at a higher angle of attack. And so the glider tries to pitch down on its own accord to increase the speed a little bit, because if you increase the speed, you can also increase the lift, just like you increase the lift if you increase the angle of attack at the same airspeed. So the glider is trying to pitch down because of the trim, where the trim is set. And so that's one of the side effects, is the pitch down as you enter into a turn, or as you get steeper into a turn. And you have to hold back, you have to pitch, or you have to hold back on the stick to increase the angle of attack, basically, is what you're doing. And then there's the overbanking tendency, is one of the third side effect that you might want to talk about. And that's primarily prevalent in the steep turns. And so talk about the overbanking, what's causing it, why it's, and how to counteract it. And then also associated with the steep turn is the yaw against the direction of the turn. Or if you think about it, that outside wingtip is flying slightly faster and producing more lift, causing the overbanking tendency. It's also flying slightly faster and producing more drag, parasitic drag, right? And so it's that's yaw against the direction of the turn, and you need a properly coordinated turn. You need a little bit of inside rudder. When I say a little bit, almost a pressure, not necessarily a movement, but a pressure, a little bit of pressure on the inside rudder, and you need opposite aileron to counteract the overbanking tendency. And then the fifth side effect of the turn is the increase in stall speed, and that's caused by the increase in load factor, right? And you should be able to illustrate that in a couple of different forms. Like you should know that in 45 degrees of bank, you have a load factor of 1.4, and the square root of 1.4 is 1.2, which is the increase in stall speed. You got a 20% increase in stall speed because you have a 40% increase in load factor. And in a steeper bank turn at 60 degrees of bank, your load factor is 2. The square root of 2 is 1.4. So the increase in stall speed is 40%, 1.4, for a load factor of 2. So, if you just know those couple of little basic understanding, then the rest of it kind of falls out. It all flows together. So. Resources and references. We always have these references, or haven't changed. And questions. That's the end of my presentation. Comments from my panel, please. Hello, are we still there?
We are still here.
Okay.
Rich, are you ready to go? Otherwise, I have a few remarks over.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Bob Wander here. A couple of items, folks. This has been a great series of presentations that Ron has put together, and I think some of you are thinking this is almost too much to take on. So let me tell you, it's not. I'm going to give you just a few remarks. You want to be a good teacher? You want to be a good flight instructor in aviation? Then do me and Rich and Ron this favor. Review all the teachers you've ever had in your entire life in every discipline, from first grade, or if you're younger than I am, from a Head Start, all the way through if you've done high school or college or graduate school or whatever. Make a list of the names of the best teachers you have ever had. And then on the other side of the ledger, make the list of, without disrespect, write down the worst teachers you've ever had. Really, do it. Write it down. Put the good teachers on the left and the not so good instructors you've ever had on the right. Once you've done that, for the good teachers you've ever had, sit back and think for a few minutes. What were the qualities they had that made them good teachers? They were prepared. They probably had a syllabus. They knew how to conduct a lesson plan. They probably spoke clearly. They probably took questions without disrespect or defense mechanisms. Write those things down for the good teachers you've had. And then for the bad teachers you've had, and I've had my share of good and bad teachers, Write down the things they did that made them, the characteristics that they exhibited that made them, let's just say, less than optimum teachers. This is a big deal. It'll take you half an hour to an hour or more to do. But if you do it, you'll see on the left-hand side of the ledger, you'll be grateful for those good teachers that you've had over your lifetime. Say, well, it wasn't rocket science. I know what they did. They were prepared. They were good-humored. They were patient. They were respectful. They understood that a question seeking deeper understanding was not an affront to their teaching ability, but rather the attempt by an earnest student to learn more about what they had to offer. And by the same token, if you look at the bad teachers, in my experience, are the ones who, even when I was paying tens of thousands of dollars for the education, I'd go to their classes and they'd say, okay, what are we doing today? As if it was my job to design their syllabus and their lesson plans. I was a student, not the master. So it isn't as complicated as you think. Just go back over your life history. I strongly advise you to do what I just advised you to do. I encourage it. On the left-hand side, write down the good teachers and what they did and why they did it, how they did it, what made them good. On the right-hand side of your ledger, write down let's just say, the less memorable teachers you've had. They may have been experts in their field. I'm not questioning that. I'm questioning whether or not they were good instructors, good teachers. And if you do that exercise, I think you will see, oh, well, now I've got a roadmap to becoming a good instructor in gliding and in general aviation. It really is not any more complicated than that. One other item I would like to make, a remark I'd like to make. Amateur instructors, that is those of us who are instructors who've never been instructors for a living in any discipline, it's easy for those candidates to try and use the cockpit when the aircraft is in flight to introduce new concepts to the candidate. That's a bad idea. Think back to when you took biology, you had the lecture, then the lab, or chemistry, you had the lecture, and then the lab. Or in the old days when I learned various languages or tried to, you had the lecture and then you went to the language lab to listen to the tapes and so on. The cockpit is a great place to be, but it's a horrible classroom if you're sitting there behind the student and the student, the candidate, the learner is in front of you in the front seat of the glider, so tandem seating. There's so much for the candidate to see and experience in the front seat of that glider that they are not going to listen to you or understand what you're saying if you are only taking this opportunity right now to introduce something brand new and complicated that you should have introduced on the ground before you got into the glider. This is a very common failure in brand new instructors. Teach the fundamentals on the ground first. Tell the candidate what this flight lesson is going to be about. And then after you launch the glider, do exactly what you said you would do so there are no new surprises. And those are the ends of my remarks. Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Bob. Rich?
So there was a question about how do I write scenarios? We've talked a lot about using SBT, and we use it extensively in the FERCs. The risk management handbook starts every chapter with as part of a scenario. The FAA says we should be using scenarios, and they provide us some examples. We have a database on the Soaring Safety Foundation website with scenarios that we've used in the FERCs. The FERC presentations are online. I use the PAVE model to help me develop scenarios because it lets me talk about who the pilot is, what skills do they have, what aircraft have I got, what's the environment, and what kind of external pressure do I want to put on them, so they can look at that. So there's a structure that lets me write a little paragraph, a couple of sentences to say, here's the scenario. But it doesn't have to be that elaborate. One of the things I like to do these days is ask someone, we have a 1,200-foot ceiling and 4 miles of visibility. How high can we do toes today? Can we do pattern toes? And that requires them to have knowledge of the airspace, the cloud clearances and visibility requirements at their airport, not at some generic place, but where they are. And that is a great little scenario, just one little sentence to say, here's what we want you to know, and here's how we can evaluate what you're actually understanding, and rather just wrote back, oh, I need clear clouds and a mile of visibility. That's not really going to be the benefit of a scenario. The benefit is they've got to put all those things together to come up with an answer that, yes, we can do a pattern tow today, or no, we can't. And so I encourage people to try practice writing little scenarios and look at what we've got aligned and what the FAA has done. And the more you practice it, the easier they are to write, to generate. And basically, you're asking people to do an open-ended question and then guide them through the discussion so they can come up with the answers that they really need to know, so they understand the material rather than just wrote back an answer. So that was one of my comment. It's a great way of going about teaching, and we strongly encourage people to use it and develop that skill.
Bravo, Rich. Wander here. I'd like to pile on to your remarks. I love your example. It's perfect. Folks, scenario-based training is simply teaching problem solving. Let me restate that. It's simply teaching your candidates to solve problems. All you need to do is present a potential problem. For instance, candidate A, here we are, we're on downwind leg, and you think you're going to be able to turn your normal approach and landing, except for there's a Bonanza on short final with no radio, a Bonanza airplane. What will you do? How will you solve the problem of this unexpected fundamental development? An unannounced airplane on short final that, if you turn too soon, will be in your flight path. Scenario-based training is simply teaching problem solving. It's really not any more complicated than that. All you need to do is do what Rich did. He just concocted a problem or a question that leads to the candidate solving a problem. What would you do if? How do we solve the problem if? Over.
Yeah, and I would just add as well, Bob and Rich, is that it allows you, the instructor, to evaluate your teaching, because you're the one who have put the ideas in their minds, the perceptions in their minds, and you're just evaluating how they would handle that, how they would solve that problem based on the instruction that you've given them. And so it's an ideal situation for you to evaluate your instruction and whether you've been teaching the concept that you want to be teaching, or whether they've been perceiving and learning the concepts that you thought that you were teaching. And so it goes hand in hand with every element, whether you're talking about the learner or the instructor, or it really scenario-based training is invaluable in instructing, teaching. Well, that's all I have. I want to thank my panel members. I've, for the last 10 weeks, we've had Rich Carlson, Soaring Safety Foundation chairman, Bert Compton, Soaring Safety trustee, Bob Wander, expert flight instructor and author of many training manuals and books, Ken Sorensen, newer flight instructor. I invited Ken on purpose so that he could, and he has presented his perspective as a newer instructor, and I think that's a valuable insight for newer instructors to. I remember when when Ken first started to talk about this, he talked to me at a contest once about, hey, I think I want to become an instructor. What do I need to do? He said, and I'm not sure if he was ready for my answer, but he took it to heart, and he really worked hard at it. It's something that you have to work hard at, and and I suspect he's, I don't, never had the privilege of being under his tutelage, but I suspect he's a valuable resource as an instructor in his club. And
Actually,
I want,
Ron, this is Ken. Let me throw in just a couple of comments.
sure.
I guess I'd start by saying that I must have been crazy and listened to you, but I got it done. At our club, the Soaring Club of Houston, one of the things that helped me get through this process and has helped others is that we actually formed what we called an instructor academy. And so we got, actually, there were probably half a dozen of us on the first of these academies that went through the instructor training process as a group. And even if you just had one other person or two other people, I think that a lot of this process that we've discussed, that you've discussed in these webinars, goes easier if you have some other people who are going through the process with you at the same time. And you can play dumb students with each other, and you can practice with each other. And we did PowerPoint presentations. I've put a bunch of this stuff up on the Google Drive that we published on this Google group for this session. But anyhow, a group effort makes the whole thing go easier if you're fortunate enough to have some other people that you can group together with.
Good point, Ken. Thank you. That's an excellent point. So I want to thank my panel. I want to give a special thank you for Frank Whiteley, who's been instrumental in producing the finished product after we get done with it, and he's been an invaluable resource to me and this panel and the SSA. I mean, I can't thank you enough, Frank, for all the things that you've done for us and the efforts that you've made to make this happen. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
And
Frank.
I want to thank the SSA too. You know, they provided some of the resources that we've had and utilized and things like that to run the webinars, and they continue to. Frank posts these webinars on the SSA website, and so without the SSA, we couldn't have done this either. So thanks to everybody involved, and I really appreciate it. I want to talk about flight maneuvers at some point in time, and so we'll put it on the bulletin board, SSA bulletin board, and other resources when the time comes. But I want to run a few sessions and talk specifically about the maneuvers that we teach and how we teach them and things like that. So I do intend to do that. I don't have a definite time frame right now. I'm personally really busy during the summer, so it'll probably be in the fall. I know that some of you are more anxious than that to get going on this, but I think that these seminars, or these webinars rather, have helped to point you in the right direction, and that's what I've really been trying to do, is to get you to look into the books and get you headed in the right direction so that you can be successful, because I know you can be successful at this, and we're looking forward to having many new instructors in our community. So thank you. And with that, unless there's something else, I'm going to sign off, and we'll we will pick this up in the fall, and we'll continue. So thank you.